What's up guys, my name is Josh, and today we're going to be reviewing the Audeze LCD 3. Now this was sent in by a patron of mine. Thank you very much, you know who you are. He does choose to stay anonymous, but if you do want to send me something, there's a link where you can send it to me down below and you can check that out and we'll go over how to get it to me. Real quick before we jump into this, I'm going to be doing a giveaway of this one-of-a-kind blue lightning cable for PeriApp that does fit with the Audeze LCD series. Now if you want to enter to win this, all you have to do is follow me on Twitter and tweet me that you want the cable. I'll go through all the submissions when I'm done with all the LCD reviews and I will send it out to you if you win. All right, that being said, let's go ahead and get on with the review of, this is the review hat now, apparently. Let's go ahead and get on with the review of the Audeze LCD 3s, starting like usual with build. So this is a very heavy headphone. This is gonna bug a lot of you. It's not the heaviest in the LCD lineup, but even the lightest of the LCD lineups are a lot for a lot of people. This personally doesn't bug me, but it may bug some of you. I'm not exactly sure on the weight. It doesn't specify on the website. But it's fairly heavy, and if you have issues with weight, this is going to be a headphone that you may want to stray away from. On this particular headphone, it does have the old school headband. If you buy this new, it does come with the updated headband, so much better, and does a much better job of distributing the weight evenly across the entire top of your head and not just the hot spot on the top like you get with this particular headband. Now the pads on this are what look and smell like real leather, although they're not nearly as plush and not nearly as comfortable as the pads that actually come on the 2C. Those pads are what I think is fake leather on those, or pleather, but they are a lot more comfortable, and the memory foam that is in those is a lot better in my opinion. But either way, these ear pads on the 3 are pretty comfortable. They don't do a great job of really keeping the weight on your ear. This is a really top heavy headphone, at least for my head shape and size. So for comfort, this is gonna get kind of like an okay grade. It's not horrible. It doesn't really have any major issues with comfort, but it's not great either. And that's mainly just due to the weight and where that weight is distributed. So in the hand, this does feel fairly solid given the weight. It doesn't really feel like it's going to fall apart. Now I wouldn't really want to drop it, but it does feel pretty solid. And honestly, the fit and finish of the wood on here, it's not going to show up correctly on film. The coloration of the printing and the way that the wood is cut and polished is really, really impressive. The fit and finish on this is immaculate. It's really, really good. So now let's talk about the power requirements of this headphone. This headphone has an impedance level of 110 ohms and comes in at a sensitivity level of 102 decibels. With this particular headphone, I actually did see quite a big difference in amplification. I will say an amp is maybe not absolutely required. You can get this to a decent listening volume off of a phone, but it is recommended. In fact, highly recommended. You're really only going to see benefits in something like this going to an amplifier. And in terms of scaling, it did scale pretty well. I have a few different amplifiers here going from like an Origin G2 all the way to an NFB1 amp. And I noticed that this sounded the best off of the 1 amp. So I do recommend an amplifier for this. All right, now let's talk about the sound of this headphone. It does a few things well, and it does a few things not so great, especially if I'm gonna be judging this as a $2,000 headphone, which I really think that I should be. So the treble. The treble is, in one word, harsh. It's fairly bright, it is fairly intense, it is detailed, it never gets really sibilant or too overly saturated, but it is very, very intense and not necessarily in a good way. It is very, very bright. In fact, I found myself more often than not turning down the volume to compensate for the treble. Now, more on the treble in a second, but for right now, I do want to talk about EQing this headphone. After I'm done with this review, I am sending this headphone over to Metal 571. If you're not familiar with him, I'll leave a link to his channel down below. He's a lot more experienced with EQing. Although I will say that in my testing for EQing, which I did want to EQ this just to see if I could cool down that treble, because I might want to bring that up. And I am able to cool it down, but I feel like it was at the sacrifice of detail and presence in the treble ranges. And I was never able to really get this treble areas to a reasonable level that also had the dexterity and clarity that I was also looking for. And it didn't seem to be able to do everything that I really wanted it to do. That could have been my fault in not being able to manipulate it properly. So for something like that, I'm hoping that Metal will kind of cover that in his review and talk about his EQ settings, because I know he does EQ a lot. And maybe he can get these to a really enjoyable level. And the mid-range in this headphone is something that I am gonna consider kind of a hidden gem. This is very, very close to neutral for mid-range, with a very slight warm tilt, a signature that I genuinely really like. A fair amount of detail and clarity in there as well. The problem is that the treble really kind of overrides and makes some vocalists and really songs in general seem a little bit harsh. And because of that, you have to lower down the volume, therefore the mid-range and the bass response get lowered as well. That, you know, of course, it does have great mid-range, but it's too overshadowed by the really harsh treble. And that was something that was really disappointing, and something that actually played into the vocals, which were also an issue. See, vocal tonality on this was excellent. Really, really good, if not among the best I've ever heard. Texture and detail was okay. There was a fair amount of nuance in vocals, although it really wasn't what I would consider to be impressive, especially for $2,000. I think headphones that come in at a tenth of the cost, being HC6XXs, do it better. Why vocals were poor on this headphone didn't have anything to do with the tonality or the texture, but it did have to do with the fact that there is very, very little separation here. Like very little at all. And I don't know exactly if it's due to the limitations in the Soundstage, which I'll cover in a second, or if it's due to that harshness and treble making you know, me have to lower the volume to compensate for that without killing my ears. Or if it's something to do with the actual mid-range itself. Even though tonally it's great, when it comes to separation, it's very poor. Now, a song that I like to use for separation is among many, many others, to be honest. But if I was just gonna highlight one that I really noticed the issue on, was gonna be Surefire by John Legend. Now, there's two reasons why I use this song. Well, really three, but let's cover two of them. One, this is a very vocally intense song. Like very, very vocally heavy. The vocals are very much pushed towards you. It's a very vocal centralized song. Just listen to it and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, the second reason I use it is because there are also very low bass notes and also very high treble notes. And in different parts of the songs, those play at equal volumes to the mid-range, but depending on that separation factor, you can still get a good vocal presence while still having good clarity, but without having the bass and the treble kind of push their way too much forward and distract from the vocals. And with bass response, it was doing very well. When the bass notes were kicking in, you had the vocals, you can hear the bass in the background, and it is textured, it is detailed, and it does have pretty good presence, but the vocals were really kind of in your face, very intense, very clear. But when you got into the later parts of the song where they start adding all these treble notes, you were lacking that separation. And those treble notes were really coming from the background into the foreground. So when you have a relatively bright track with vocals, this could really be a problem. Now, a couple artists that would stand out for that, for me, and how they choose to do their tracks a lot of the time, is like Sam Smith. He has great vocals. On most headphones, it's very forward, but he also does use a lot of tambourine, a lot of hi-hats, and even some electronic music in the background that I found to be too intense for the track on this, and I didn't find it to have good accuracy with vocal separation. Another common artist was Adele. Adele is an artist that I tend to think that they really cool down the highs in a lot of her songs to make her voice really pop. And despite her being a superstar, she actually doesn't have the best recording quality in any of her tracks, which is very strange. But that aside, that's a whole different thing. With her vocal separation and with even what I consider to be cooled down highs to where they're not as hot, not as bright, this was still coming through a little bit too intense in the high ranges for me. And I was getting kind of this weird lack of vocal separation for certain tracks. Other tracks that didn't have much high presence at all, it really wasn't an issue. Another thing I noticed with vocals and like standout song, and I've brought this up multiple times, but I do think it's a good reference, is the Postmodern Jukebox cover of Dream On with Morgan James as the vocalist, specifically her. I think they have two covers of that song. I could be mistaken, but that's the cover I want to talk about specifically. And she is an artist who can really just throw her voice and just absolutely belt. And is that the right word, belt? Like really go at it? Anyways, she can really, really scream, and it's a good, like screaming in a good way. She has a very, very impressive voice. But on the LCD3s, they're just way, way, way too piercing for me to really enjoy. And that is a song that I love. Like I listen to that song all of the time, and it's a song that I personally really, really enjoy. To me, this is really, really disappointing. Having songs that I'm physically limited because it actually hurts me to listen to is kind of a big problem for me, and it's really hard for me to recommend this. Maybe if you're really okay or not very sensitive to treble. I'm fairly sensitive to treble. I would say more sensitive than the average, although not quite as extreme as some people. But it is a concern for me with the headphone. I do think that certain headphones are too bright, and this is definitely one of them. Okay, so bass response. So bass response kind of follows the same kind of formula that the mid-range does. Fairly pleasant. It's not the most intense. It doesn't have a whole lot of impact or a whole lot of what I've coined as girth. You know, just like a really like solid feeling. It does kind of lack that a little bit, but it does feel very in line with the mid-range. And if you were looking for good performance there, it's definitely got it. It's not the best that I've ever heard. It's not the most intense. It's definitely not the most impactful. I found it very natural sounding without lacking or being overly emphasized. So I would say a pretty good bass response. Okay, so imaging at Soundstage is, imaging is very, very good. It's able to do all the way left to right without hardly any dead zones, maybe a few dips here and there, but nothing too major or nothing really worth noting. The problem is the Soundstage, and I know it kind of seems like I'm hating on this headphone, and I'm really trying not to. It is a cool headphone. It's a nice headphone. It's a fairly pleasant headphone, but under critical analysis, it really doesn't hold up, especially to the price tag. The imaging is good, although not particularly tight or class leading, but the Soundstage is very, very poor. It doesn't have the ability to feel intimate nor very far out. It just kind of has a very middle of the road type of soundstage where it's decently far out, but it's not too far, but it's also not very intimate. And the variation between intimacy and far outness and having that dexterity isn't really there. It's actually fairly poor. In fact, one of my soundstage and imaging tests is a song called Down by the Riverside by Noah Hill. Now, the guitar in the very beginning comes to the far, far left. And on most headphones, even like something like these, like the SHP 9500s, which are a fairly intimate sounding headphone, that guitar sounds like it is coming from far, far left. Like it really sounds like it's coming from far away. And on pretty much almost every headphone that I've tried that song on, it sounds like it's coming from really far away, but not this headphone. It just sounds like it's coming like right here. It just sounds very, very close. And although it can never seem intimate, it also never seems far away, and there's no fluctuation there. So it has very limited soundstage capabilities, although the imaging is decent. In this category, this imaging and soundstage category, it's really lackluster for me. Okay, now I have some final thoughts before presenting my conclusion here. Some things that I picked up on, especially going from the LCDX to these and listening back and forth. And the LCDX comes in about $1,200. The LCDX is one of the best headphones that I've ever tried, period. Just as a whole, as a conglomerate of a headphone, it is one of the best. And by one of the best, I mean top three. I would probably put Stax up there, 1990s and LCDXs, and I would appreciate them differently for different things. And that's just my personal taste. And going from the X to this makes one thing very, very clear, which is that the 3 has two things that I really think are lacking in this headphone, comparatively at least. One is going to be, and I don't know if this is the right word, but the transparency of the room and being able to like visualize the instruments and hear them in the room that they're playing in, and not just the tones, and having a more holographic sound. The 3 basically can't do that at all. And then you go to the X or something like the Stax, or even something lower end like the SHPs, those are able to do that really holographic sound way better than the 3s do. They don't really do it at all. It was very, very disappointing in that area. And the other thing that I noticed was everything that when you go from the X to the 3, except for treble, seems slightly muffled. The whole headphone, honestly, if you put the headphone on me and I was blindfolded, didn't know what headphone it was, I would say that it sounds like a good but bright closed back headphone, because that's really what it sounds like. It has a muffled sound to it, and it doesn't sound holographic or free to me. And that to me is one of the big factors that really separates a high-end headphone from a mediocre headphone. A mediocre headphone will play sounds, but it won't necessarily play the experience. It doesn't have that holographic, and I know I'm overusing that term, but I don't know another way to describe kind of the the feeling of the music around you and feeling like you're part of the music, you're in the music. This really just doesn't have that. And I think that's one of the things that separates really good headphones and headphones that just aren't good. And I think honestly, this is a really overpriced headphone. And I think that's gonna pretty much lead us and kind of spoil the conclusion here. For the price, I would mark this like a 6 out of 10. If you were to take away price, is this a good headphone? Yes. Is it a particularly impressive headphone in any particular category that I can recommend it for? Not really. That's why it's not getting a higher score. If it maybe did some things poorly, but some things very, very well, I could recommend it. Now, I'd love for it to be like, oh, it does some things poorly, yeah, but it does this really, really, really well. Kind of like the One Mores. It's like, it's not the most perfect headphone in the world, but it does movies fantastically. So I can be like, hey, if you like movies, go do this. There's not really a category where I see this being a headphone that people should gravitate towards. I really don't see anything for this. It's got great tonality to it. It is overly bright, but let's take away the brightness for this conclusion. Let's just say that let's just not consider that as a factor. Other problems that this headphone has is that the tonality is absolutely excellent, but the presentation of the sound is the issue. The presentation is severely lacking in a headphone. And for a headphone that costs $2,000, it needed more and it just doesn't have it. So I'm sorry to say that I really can't recommend this. It's not a horrible headphone, but for the price, it is really, really overpriced. And even buying these used on the market, I think they sell for about 1,200 bucks. If you were gonna spend 1,200 bucks, get the X's, man. Even if you were gonna spend 1,000 bucks, save up or get like a used pair of X's, because the X's really are incredible and they're really, really good. That review is coming out soon. I'm not sure exactly when. I had the headphones for a while. So the other headphones I had to send out and stuff, so I wanted to get those reviews done first. But the X's I have for a while, so I'm gonna take my time with that review. So I do wanna thank the very nice gentleman who does wish to remain anonymous for sending these out. It was a fun experience. I am glad you sent these out. Even if I don't like the product, I still do really appreciate you sending them out, and I genuinely mean that. So thank you very much. All right, guys, I think you're gonna find links to all of my other recommended products. I'll link this product, but I also have an Amazon kind of influencer page where I have all the different categories: closed back, warm headphones, bright headphones, neutral headphones, that you can go through and see all of my top recommendations. I highly recommend you checking that out, especially if you're looking for like a real simple kind of buying guide of sorts. It's all through Amazon. It's all easy. Prime shipping is amazing. So check all those things out. Patreon, if you do want to get early access to videos like this one. But yeah, so I think I'll catch you guys in the next video. Have a good one. Peace.